In Chicago, there was no more dangerous a time than during Prohibition. The city's rackets were cut into turf, and the Northsiders quickly controlled bootlegging, taking over breweries and distilleries. Led by Dion O'Banion and Jaime Weiss, they had complete monopolies over bootlegging and controlled every single facet. To keep a firm grip on the 42nd and 43rd wards, O'Banion would use his political ties and even rig elections to keep things steered to his benefit. To help offset the public outcry, he would donate to charities and orphanages. O'Banion, to add insult to injury, would often hijack Southside bootlegging operations only to sell them right back to the Southside for 3 times the net worth. Many times the Italians attempted to sit down with O'Banion to keep the peace, but O'Banion couldn't stand them and would often abuse them at these meetings. It really came down to the North Side encroaching into the South Side's turf, and the North Side's refusal to keep the peace. Eventually the sides would broker peace, but time and time again, O'Banion would renege. And in 1924, O'Banion would offer to sell the Seaman Brewery to Johnny Torrio. When Torrio went to inspect the property, police would raid it. O'Banion had set Torrio up. On October 10th of 1925, Torrio had enough. He ordered O'Banion's death. Frankie Yale, John Scalish, and Albert Anselmi would enter the Schofield flower shop that O'Banion ran and killed him in a hail of gunfire. That began a 5-year bloodbath. Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran would then take over O'Banion's crew, and more bloodshed would begin. In 1925, as temperatures reached another boiling point between the mob and Bugsy Moran, Al Capone was ambushed but somehow managed to escape the murder. 12 days later, Johnny the Fox Torrio, Capone's rabbi and leader, was shot several times after shopping at a local store. It's then that Torrio sees the writing on the wall and hands over the throne to Al Capone. Moran, in an attempt to hurt Capone's political allies, killed 2 powerful Union leaders who were friends under the protection of Capone. Capone had seen enough. February 14th, 1929, Northsiders were lured to a garage with the promise of a stolen cut-rate shipment of whiskey supplied by the Detroit's Purple Gang, which was associated with Capone. Witnesses say that they saw a Cadillac sedan pull up to a stop in front of the garage. 4 men would emerge and walk inside, 2 of them dressed in police uniform. The 2 fake police officers carried shotguns and entered the rear portion of the garage, where they found members of the Moran's gang and associates Reinhard Schwimmer and John May, who was fixing one of the trucks. The fake policemen then ordered the men to line up against the wall. They then signaled to a pair of civilian-clothed men who accompanied them. 2 of the killers opened up fire with Tommy guns, one with a 20-round box magazine and the other with a 50-round drum. They were thorough, spraying their victims left and right, even continuing to fire after all 7 had hit the floor. 2 shotgun blasts afterwards all but obliterated the faces of John May and James Clark, according to the coroner's report. Bugs Moran, who was supposed to be killed that day, was running late, and that is the only reason why he was not murdered. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was one of the biggest mob hits ever, probably the biggest mafia hit in the history of organized crime. And whereas you might suspect that hit would have put Al Capone in full control of the mafia, it didn't. All it did was bring heat. It would eventually end Al Capone's run as the boss of Chicago. Bugsy Siegel, the mob's man in Las Vegas. Bugsy went from the slums in New York City to become the mob's pioneer in the desert. Bugsy made his bones in the early days of the mob with Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. Known as an earner and a guy whose temper was volcanic, he was suited best to run the rackets for the Italians. Not only did he have expertise in gambling, but his expertise in murder became a valued commodity in the early days of the mob. Known as a prolific hitman, he was also a leader within Murder Incorporated. Good-looking, talented, and unwavering in loyalty, he climbed the ranks of American Cosa Nostra and became a juggernaut in his own right. Just at the tail ending of Prohibition, Siegel would pour his efforts into gambling. With the heat on Murder Incorporated, Siegel would head out west, California, for sunshine and starlets, and gambling, as the mob wanted someone in California to establish the rackets that Jack Dragna couldn't seem to get established. In 1941, Siegel would show his prowess as a mob muscle man when former friend and mob ally Harry Greenberg demanded $5,000 from Louis Lepke. Otherwise, he would begin to give information to police. Louis Lepke wasn't about to give into an informant's demands, and the contract was handed to Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy, along with Frankie Carbo and Whitey Krakow, assassinated Greenberg in his own driveway with 5 shots to the head at point-blank range. Bugsy would be arrested for that murder, but a mistrial ensued in 1940. A second trial would begin in 1942, with Frankie Carbo as the main defendant in that trial. Krakow, who the mob saw as a potential squealer, had been killed right after the first trial. Abe Rellis, infamous informant, had agreed to go out west to testify against Carbo and Siegel, but he couldn't because he was thrown out of a window to his death in 1941, which was ruled a suicide. Siegel then begins to shake down everyone in Hollywood. After all the press and shady business, he knew he needed to change his image. Siegel purchased the El Cortez for $600,000 in Las Vegas with hopes that he could turn it into a gambling hall. But city officials knew of his reputation and refused to grant him any permits, so he began to look outside of the city. He had heard that businessman William Wilkerson was building the Flamingo in the desert and had plans to make it a gambling hall and destination. Siegel would head out to the desert and essentially shake down Wilkerson's, taking over control of the Flamingo. While the Flamingo wasn't built, Siegel would ask for the mob's help in the form of loans to build the casino and make it the most luxurious place in the desert. The mob would hand over the money with promises that the loan would be returned to them plus profits. Siegel would then begin the building of the Flamingo. The problem was, Siegel wasn't a hands-on guy and was frequently back in Los Angeles not paying attention to the construction. Because he was back and forth, he would put his girlfriend at the time, Virginia Hill, in control of supervising the construction of the building. What the builders were doing was stealing materials during the night, reporting that Hill, who then would report back to Bugsy of the theft, would basically shake Bugsy Siegel down and charge him twice for those same exact materials they stole the night before. And Siegel, because he's, back and forth in Los Angeles, doesn't really notice what's going on, and they begin to take advantage of that, doing it multiple times. Costs would begin to rise quickly, and Siegel began bouncing checks everywhere, and he kept asking his friends in the mob for money. It would reach the point where the mafia had put $6 million into the construction, which in today's money is close to $75 million. To make matters worse, there were issues with the racing wire, which Siegel controlled on behalf of the mafia. While certain issues would clear up, Siegel stopped reporting the numbers back to Chicago and New York, and essentially explained that he was the boss of California and he would handle the money issues down the road. It was the first sign that Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was skimming money. The casino would open in December of 46, and it wasn't even finished. Only the casino, the lounge, the theater, and the restaurant were done. Lansky, who arrived that night, was stunned to hear construction sounds and seeing drop cloths all over the place. The hotel rooms weren't even finished, and the casino lost a ton of money. By January, with losses over $500,000, the casino was shut down. The mob was furious, and they give Bugsy Siegel one more shot. Bugsy gets down to business, he finishes the construction, and he gets himself and the casino some great press. On March 1st of 1947, they would reopen. The casino made a lot of money, and the next few months, the take would change dramatically, and the mob wanted their profits back. They wanted the loans back. They had heard rumors that Virginia Hill was traveling to Switzerland and going to a bank that the mob used to hide money. The commission back in New York was fed up, and only at the begging of Meyer Lansky did they look into those rumors. Lansky was able to ascertain that Hill definitely was smuggling money into banks in Switzerland. Luciano at the Havana conference had heard enough and ordered his death. June 20th of 1947, Siegel was sitting in Virginia Hill's house with Alan Smiley. Hill had left hours earlier, shocking Siegel, who had plans with Hill later on that evening, but she said that she had to go and meet somebody. While reading the paper, Frankie Carbo would open up fire outside of the window with an M1 carbine, shooting Siegel in the face, neck, and head, and the body over a dozen times. It was the end of the line for the mob's man in Las Vegas.
And as we reported earlier, Angelo Bruno, the reputed mobster leader, was back before the State Commission of Investigation today, and this time he was apparently answering questions. Kent Manahan has the story.
Angelo Bruno was once again mobbed by reporters, and as usual, he wasn't doing much talking.
Are you in order not to talk to us?
But apparently he was in a mood to talk to the SCI commissioners, as he later indicated to us on the way out of today's session.
I told you once before, as far as I'm concerned, you can come in, listen to everything. As long as they okay it, you have my okay, because there's nothing I have to hide.
Today's testimony was conducted in secret and was over in about 3.5 hours. Bruno, who allegedly runs organized crime in Philadelphia and South Jersey, was before the SCI last month in a lengthy session. He refused to answer certain questions and was ordered to appear in Superior Court twice in the same day, where he was threatened with jail if he continued his silence. Bruno has been under an SCI subpoena since 1970 and has been talking on and off to the commission during those years under a grant of immunity from prosecution. Chairman of the State Commission of Investigation, Michael Siavage, explains that means only the information given by Bruno is immune from prosecution.
In other words, only the information that the witness is giving us about a particular crime is immunized. He could still be charged by another agency, for instance, for that crime, as long as we haven't told them that information.
Siavage added the SCI is getting important information by talking to Bruno.
I think there's various possible alternative accomplishments. One's already been accomplished with Mr. Bruno in Atlantic City, for instance. One hope is that he will give us information that will lead to an in-depth investigation on a particular facet of New Jersey life and how it's affected by organized crime.
Angelo Bruno is scheduled to be back before the SCI sometime after the first of the year. An exact date has not yet been set. In Trenton, I'm Kent Manahan.
Angelo Bruno, one of the last in the old guard, known as the Gentle Don for rather ending problems with a soft voice than a gun, got his start through Michael Maggio in South Philadelphia, who was an associated member of the Philadelphia mob. Bruno, whose strong work ethics impressed Maggio, would introduce Bruno to the world of organized crime. Bruno would then begin to operate small rackets and errands for then-boss Salvatore Sabella. It was through friendships that Bruno would get involved in bootlegging operations for Sabella, along with Carlo Gambino. In the 1930s, Bruno would get his button. After Sabella died, Joe Dovey would take over as boss of the Philadelphia Mafia, then be replaced by Joe Ida. Ida would then be expelled from the United States. Ida would have a choice between two of his top earners in Bruno and Antonio Polina. He would choose the latter, and Polina worried about Bruno's capacity for power and wanted to have him killed, and actually asks the commission back in New York for permission to kill Bruno. But because of Bruno's friendship with Carlo Gambino, permission would be denied. Gambino and Bruno had business ties and a close bond, and Gambino was incensed with Polina's desire to kill Bruno, and instead backs Bruno, and Bruno becomes the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia in 1959. Bruno was a powerful boss and had the respect of all of New York's 5 families. Under Bruno, the Philadelphia Mafia moved into unions and traditional rackets. In 1971, Bruno became the longest tenured boss in Philadelphia's crime history. In 1976, legislation would pass in Atlantic City, New Jersey to legalize gambling. With Bruno's contacts, especially with Russell Buffalino, who controlled interests in steel in Pittsburgh, arranged for the construction companies building these casinos to use his steel contacts. This added more power to Bruno and made Philadelphia a powerhouse in the mafia. As the casinos went up, Bruno controlled the unions in those casinos and was getting a kickback from every casino. After the death of Carlo Gambino in October of 1976, the mafia in New York wanted to cut a profits from Atlantic City, which Bruno absolutely refused to do. While it angered those back in New York, Bruno stood his ground and stood strong. In the late 1970s, narcotics became a big factor in organized crime. Every family was involved in some sort of capacity. Bruno, who had a stance against drugs, his stance was that his men were not allowed to sell drugs on any condition. His men, who wanted a cut of the narcotics racket, specifically meth, were infuriated by Bruno's stance because while Bruno denied requests from his captains and soldiers to move and to get into narcotics, he allowed the Gambinos in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, to move massive amounts of narcotics for a big kickback. It was Philadelphia's turf, and allowing another crime family to operate in their area and make millions while Bruno filled his pockets infuriated the rank and file. Antonio Caponegro, Bruno's consigliere, had seen enough. He wanted control of the narcotics rackets and felt that Bruno bent over backwards for other crime families instead of his own. Caponegro would reach out to Frank Funzi Thierry, who at the time was the acting street boss of the Genovese crime family. Thierry and Caponegro had a beef going back a few decades when Thierry tried to encroach on Caponegro's turf. A sit-down was held over the matter and Caponegro won, and Funzi Thierry never forgot it. Caponegro would speak to Thierry about murdering Bruno and taking over the Philadelphia Mafia. Thierry would tell Caponegro that not only would he back the move, but he assured Caponegro that the commission back in New York would sanction that murder. March 21st of 1980, while sitting in his car outside of his house with John Stampa at the intersection of 10th and Snyder, Bruno would be killed instantly with a shotgun blast to the back of the head. Weeks later, Caponegro, who thought he would ascend the throne of the Philadelphia Mafia, was called to New York to meet with the commission. At that meeting, he swore that Funzi Thierry greenlit the murder, which Thierry flatly denied ever doing. Weeks later, Caponegro's body would be found in the trunk of a car in the Bronx. Others who were involved were either tortured and killed systematically. It would spark a war in Philadelphia for leadership for the next 4 years, which would include 20 murders. Tony Spilotro. Tony got his start with the Chicago outfit after hanging around mob clubs in his youth and eventually would catch the eye of Vincent Ansero and Joey the Clown Lombardo. And by the age of 20, he was placed in Mad Sam DiStefano's crew. Tony was the perfect fit in Mad Sam's crew because he had a taste for violence to the extreme that he instilled fear in everyone on the streets. He would learn from Mad Sam how to ice pick men with proficiency and learn how to learn torture techniques that the mob could use at their disposal. His first contract came through Mad Sam DiStefano. DiStefano handed him the contract on the lives of Jimmy Maraglia and Billy McCarthy. Both Maraglia and McCarthy had murdered 2 thieves in Elmwood Park, which the mob considered their turf and didn't like anyone committing murders in their area and wanted a message to be sent. Spilotro just not murdered them, but he also tortured them, and he put McCarthy's head in a vice till his eyes popped out before killing him. Both McCarthy and Maraglia would be found in the trunk of a car on Chicago's South Side. Both were covered in maggots and had their throats slit. Spilotro made an impression, to say the least. Those murders would get Spilotro his button in 1963. With his button, he begins to expand on the Northwest Side, controlling bookmaking. As brutal as Tony Spilotro was, his character and demeanor marked him for consistent police raids and harassment. Eventually, Spilotro would have to face the reality that law enforcement eyes were all over him, and he would be sent to Las Vegas by Joe Dove's IUPA to take over Marshall Califano's role of being the mob's representative in Las Vegas. Spilotro's role was to oversee the skimming proceeds. Frank Lefty Rosenthal was out there as well, and he was the mob's handicapper and the man responsible for ensuring that the cash boxes were emptied. Spilotro was there to oversee Rosenthal and other members of the Chicago outfit in Las Vegas. What Spilotro does next is he begins to force everyone to pay a street tax to him. He would open up the gold rush with his brother Michael, and they would fence stolen goods through the business. Then Spilotro would form the Hole in the Wall gang in Las Vegas, and they would break into hotel rooms, stores, and homes, stealing and selling goods. In 1979, the FBI would flip Jerry Lisner, who was willing to testify to Spilotro's dealings, but Spilotro acted first, having Frank Culotta kill Lisner. With Spilotro's actions and bravado, the Nevada Gaming Commission and the FBI were watching very close. Eventually, Spilotro would be blacklisted from working in the casinos. Spilotro then sort of goes off the reservation, loan sharking and bookmaking and creating problems wherever he goes. He then gets embroiled in a sexual relationship with Frank Lefty Rosenthal's wife, and all of this news was getting back to Chicago. Chicago was getting fed up considering they sent him to Las Vegas to oversee things and not act like a mob boss. The Hole in the Wall gang would eventually be caught July 4th of 1981 attempting to bust into Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings. Everyone would get arrested except for Tony Spilotro, who was nowhere to be found. One by one, Tony's men begin to flip, giving authorities information about Tony and the Chicago outfit. Culotta would testify against Spilotro, but Culotta was a horrible witness and was caught repeatedly lying on the stand, and Spilotro would be acquitted. Almost as soon as that trial ended, Spilotro would be indicted for casino skimming, a big no-no. Spilotro had let the power go to his head, and rather than laying low, he exposed Chicago's operations in Las Vegas. The mob back east had had enough. They called Tony and ordered him back to Chicago for a meeting. The premise of that meeting was to figure out what to do about Las Vegas and the promise of inducting Tony's brother Michael into the mob. The meeting was set for a house in Bensonville, Illinois. When Tony and Michael entered the basement, they were beaten and strangled to death. The bodies were then transported by car to a cornfield in Enos, Indiana, where they would be found on June 22nd of 1986. It's worth noting Tony had murdered Sam Giancana and Mad Sam DiStefano and was brutally murdered in the same way that he killed others.
The Bushwick section of Brooklyn. 4 masked men armed with automatic weapons pulled up outside. Minutes later, Galante and 2 others at the table were dead, and a 4th person seriously wounded. The gunman escaped. Galante looked more like a grandfather than a godfather as he walked his dog each morning in Greenwich Village. He was born in East Harlem, New York, and began his career as leader of a juvenile gang. In all, he spent 25 years in prison, but he rose steadily through the mafia ranks, from enforcer to chieftain. Along the way, according to authorities, he's believed to have killed or ordered the killing of about 100 men. Galante's legal front was a dry cleaning shop in New York's Little Italy, but his real interests embraced gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and most of all, heroin and other drugs. Last fall, while in prison for breaking parole by consorting with known criminals, Galante was placed under federal protection after authorities reportedly were tipped off that a rival mafia group had put out a contract on him. After he was released on bail last March, 60 Minutes filmed this conversation between Galante and his lawyer, Roy Cohn.
I'm going to leave in the morning and go to the country.
Good. What are you going to do when you get to the country?
Well, I mean, I planted peppers last week, now I'm going to plant tomatoes.
The 69-year-old Galante was apparently involved in a power struggle for the #1 mafia position. Galante lost today, but police still don't know who won. And according to one expert, there may be several more killings before they find out. 60 Minutes filmed this conversation between Galante and his lawyer, Roy Cohn.
I'm going to leave in the morning and go to the country. Good. Peppers last week, now I'm going to plant tomatoes.
69-year-old
Carmine Galante began his ascent into organized crime during Prohibition. By the age of 15, he was collecting debts for the mob. By age 20, he committed his first murder by killing an NYPD cop during a robbery. Although he would never be indicted for that murder, it didn't curb his appetite for mayhem. That same year, he would shoot another NYPD cop when he was caught trying to hijack a truck in Brooklyn. This time, he would be caught and he would be sent upstate for 12 years. He would be released in 1939. By 1940, he was beginning his rise in the mafia by carrying out mob hits for Vito Genovese. In 1943, he hits Carlo Tresca, who ran a newspaper with anti-fascist viewpoints against Benito Mussolini. Genovese had set that murder up from Italy while he was exiled trying to escape murder charges himself. As the 1950s hit, Galante began working for Joe Bonanno. Joe Bonanno was encroaching into Canadian territory and needed someone to oversee the narcotics distribution and rackets. Galante would steer Vic Catroni and others into the French Connection, and business was good. Galante began to expand into Montreal, controlling the lucrative drug trade and the gambling rackets, pulling in over $50 million a year for the Bonanno crime family. Eventually, with his heightened public persona, Galante would be thrown out of Canada completely, but his work had been valued, and he was promoted to consigliere of the Bonanno crime family for his actions. In 1950, he would attend a heroin summit in Italy whereby Sicilians would control the flow of narcotics into the United States. In 1958, Galante would be indicted on narcotics charges and then would go into hiding. It wouldn't last, as he would be arrested in New Jersey in 1959 and would be indicted for those charges as well as other narcotics charges. In 1960, his first trial began and would end in a mistrial. His second trial would begin in 1962, and he would be found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. In 1974, Carmine Galante is released from prison and announces his arrival by blowing the doors off Frank Costello's crypt, whom he never liked. Also in that year, Rusty Rastelli was named the new boss of the Bonanno crime family. However, by 1976, Rastelli would be indicted and sent to prison, and Carmine Galante wanted to be crowned king. Galante wanted to establish full control of the drug rackets, which the Gambino crime family was in full control of. So Galante begins his power move by killing Gambino-made guys, including captains. Galante kills 8 made men in the Gambino crime family to signify his arrival in power. The 5 families were terrified of Carmine Galante and his willingness to kill to get his point across. Something had to be done. Rusty Rastelli sends words through Joe Massino from prison that he wanted Galante killed, as Rastelli believed, and he was the rightful boss in name of the Bonanno crime family. The commission would agree that Rastelli was the rightful boss, and they would green light the murder of Carmine Galante. July 12th of 1979, while eating lunch outside of Joe and Mary's, 6 ski mask-clad men walk out into the back patio and light Galante up with shotguns and handguns. Galante and 2 of his men were killed alongside of him. Galante went out in a hail of gunfire. He lived by the gun, and he died by the gun.